Enjoy the short story. Please subscribe. The Battle of Hue had been a nightmare. It had begun on January 31, 1968, and lasted for 26 days. The mass graves discovered in and around Hue in the aftermath were shocking. Men, women, children, and even infants were brutally killed. The estimated death toll was between 2,800 and 6,000 civilians and prisoners of war, which was between 5 to 10% of the total population of Hue. Victims were found bound, tortured, and sometimes buried alive. Many victims were also clubbed to death. This massacre was possibly the largest atrocity of the war. It was late in the evening on February 1 when Nguyen left his small shop to head home. As he turned the corner onto his street, he saw Viet Cong soldiers rounding up his neighbors, forcing them to walk down the road. Nguyen tried to turn back, but a gun was pointed at his head. He had no choice but to join the group of people being herded down the road. They walked for hours, sometimes in silence and sometimes in fear, until they reached a school that had been converted into a prison. Inside the school, the captives were held in cramped rooms with little food or water. Each day, a few people were taken away and never seen again. Nguyen tried to remain optimistic, thinking that maybe the soldiers would soon release them. But that hope was short-lived. One day, Nguyen was called into a room where he was met with a group of Viet Cong soldiers. They accused him of being a spy and a traitor. Nguyen pleaded with them, explaining that he was just a shopkeeper, but they didn't believe him. They dragged him outside and lined him up with a group of other prisoners. Nguyen knew what was coming. He heard the gunshots and the screams. When it was his turn, he tried to remain brave. But as the bullet pierced his skin, his world went black. Nguyen was one of the thousands of victims of the Hue Massacre. His body was dumped in a mass grave, along with countless others. For years, his family searched for him, but they never found his remains. The memories of him, however, stayed with them forever. Years later, Nguyen's grandson would visit Hue. He walked the streets where his grandfather had lived and worked, trying to imagine what life must have been like before the war. As he stood on the banks of the Perfume River, he couldn't help but feel overwhelmed with sadness. He knew that his grandfather had suffered and died in this place, but he also knew that his memory would live on. As he turned to leave, he saw a group of school children playing on the riverbank. They were laughing and running, oblivious to the horrors that had taken place in their city so many years ago. And for a moment, Nguyen's grandson felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for peace and healing in this place. Many of the victims were found bound, tortured, and sometimes buried alive. The horror of the Hue Massacre was made even worse by the fact that it was not an isolated incident. Similar atrocities were committed throughout the country during the Tet Offensive, as the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong sought to undermine the morale of the South Vietnamese government and its allies. In the aftermath of the massacre, the U.S. and South Vietnamese governments faced intense criticism from the international community for their role in the war. Many argued that the indiscriminate bombing campaigns and heavy-handed tactics used by American forces had only served to fuel the hatred and violence that led to events like the Hue Massacre. Despite the condemnation and outrage that followed the massacre, few of those responsible were ever held accountable. Many of the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops involved in the killings were simply allowed to blend back into the civilian population, while the South Vietnamese government and its allies continued to pursue their own brutal campaigns against suspected communist sympathizers. In the years that followed, the memory of the Hue Massacre continued to haunt the people of Vietnam, as well as those who had fought in the war. It served as a stark reminder of the atrocities that can be committed in the name of ideology, and the devastating toll that war can take on both the innocent and the guilty alike. As the war dragged on, however, many began to question whether the sacrifices being made by both sides were worth the cost. In the end, it was not military victory that brought an end to the conflict, but rather a growing sense of weariness and disillusionment among the American and South Vietnamese publics. In 1975, the North Vietnamese forces finally succeeded in overrunning the South Vietnamese government, bringing an end to the war and the suffering it had caused. But the scars of the Hue Massacre and the countless other atrocities committed during the conflict would continue to haunt the people of Vietnam for years to come. Thank you for your support. Please like and subscribe.